All right, is everyone good to begin the round? Okay, I invite the Prime Minister to deliver the first constructive speech.
All right. So sorry, let me just get my timer out. And I shall begin. All right, so firstly, we're going to define the framework as whatever makes people happiest, essentially the idea of Aristotelian contentment. We define this house as a rational human being. Widespread belief means that all global philosophies are rooted in this idea of radical freedom in the motion, and radical freedom is already defined in the motion, so we won't define that. Our first contention is full responsibility. With radical freedom, all people are completely responsible for all their actions, and there's nothing that makes them forced to do something. And since nothing outside of a person forces them to act in any particular way, people are completely responsible for the outcomes of their actions. However, a person's actions do not express their own character. It also reflects that person's view of what's good for humanity as a whole. With this idea, we can punish criminals because actions are solely their own and don't reflect anything else. Values develop because if you are free, you'll be able to care for others around you. And if you are forced to do something, you lose that value of freedom. And it's fundamental to the development of other values, such as peace, life, and liberty. Without freedom, there's no way we can espouse these values. The reason for this being that you need to be absolutely and utterly in control of yourself in order to think about others. So if you're not free, and if you do things that you don't want to do, then how can you say, oh, well, I value freedom, or, oh, well, I value liberty, or even security, if you're not even free, if you're being influenced? So you have to have freedom to develop values, which is something that's incredibly important. The impact of here, if you're held completely and utterly responsible for your actions, you'll be far less likely to commit a crime. We're putting individual resolve in charge of everything. And so the impact here is that crime goes down under our framework, and people actually take full responsibility for their actions because they are solely their own. Our second contention is self-interest is a good thing. And our first sub-contention is individualism for economy. The lessons of Adam Smith, a famous 18th century Scottish economist, that the individualist economy already works better, and it's globally accepted. Even China, which is technically communist, use individual actors such as small business and capitalists today to run the economy. Basically, people produce more when they're working where they want. If they do not work where they want, they'll clearly be less interested in the job and less productive. And individualism is therefore good because if everyone works where they want, the economy will be more productive and efficient. And it's borne out not only by logical warranting, but by real-world examples. Our second, yes.
So let's say in a culture, like a large amount of like warrior stuff is produced and such, and then everyone wants to become a warrior. Is that beneficial to the economy?
All right, so as I'll get into a little bit later, it's actually interesting because people don't inherently want to be certain things. I think the issue here is that you're really kind of making it so that everyone wants to be one thing, whereas in reality, that's actually the opposite of the truth, because the whole idea of individualism is that not everyone is the same. Everyone is different, and people want to do different things. So in a hypothetical culture where every single person wants to be a warrior, that just wouldn't exist. So I don't see how that's at all relevant to the scope of this debate, because everyone wants to be different. If I grew up and I want to be a carrot farmer, I'm going to become a carrot farmer. So the second sub-contention I have is individualism for happiness. Acting in your own self-interest makes people far more happy because they can do whatever they want to their heart's content. What do people innately want? They want stability, a way to care for their family and themselves, and they want safety. So why would there be any incentive for crime there? No one would want to be a criminal because people get into crime to make money, but there's more money in this individualist economy. People want stability, safety, and money can be far easier gotten in the society because of the idea of the individualist economy. People who genuinely want to help others will be willing to be police officers, to be firefighters, to be public servants, and above all, to be good citizens, because people don't inherently wish evil upon others. People are inherently good. They don't wish evil upon others because it does nothing to benefit them. If I yes.
Aren't cops contradictory to individualism because they force upon a state power onto the individual? Okay, so again, the whole idea of individualism is doing what you want. That doesn't mean your actions don't have repercussions. My entire first contention was about how you have to be you're held accountable for your actions. So yes, as an individualist, you can do what you want. That's fine. But you don't get that. The whole idea here is that individualism and radical freedom is an idea to have better economy, better stability, and more happiness. And individualism is good because you're responsible for everything you do. And people acting in this way makes them happy.
Right, the impact here, people are happy. Passing this motion allows us to achieve full Aristotelian contentment, which is what a rational person would want. And the second impact of my first sub-contention is that the economy will grow. Passing the motion will not only cause society to collapse. Since money makes people happier, it will raise the standard of living, and it'll make this house happier. My third contention is that it isn't anarchy. Nothing in the motion says that there's no government for the individuals. The world isn't just anarchy. If a maximum security prisoner says, I want to escape prison, that doesn't change anything, right? He can try to act on it, but it's not as if a maximum security prison says, I have the freedom to leave, and then just leaves. That's not how it works.
POI.
No, thank you. So what this means is that, for example, someone, quote unquote, decides to nuke the entire world. That doesn't mean they're instantly able to obtain nuclear weapons. Government is still able to keep the society safe. And people work in public service because they want to help people. People whose innate desire is to help the world/nation will be trying their best to keep people safe. And there are plenty of people in the world that will do this. In fact, the government runs better because those who are corrupt and do not want to help people will be exposed and punished for their actions, which are their own. Corruption in the government goes to virtually nothing because they want to
POI.
No, thank you. Screw over the people. And a sub-contention here is Lockean ideals, right? Thomas Locke believed that a democracy for the people and by the people was best. He genuinely believed this because he thought people were innately good and were interested in helping others. People aren't inherently evil and they want what's best for them. Going back to the idea of the Adam Smith individualist society, we can clearly see that if everyone acts in their own self-interest, the economy works better. And the idea that immediately people will just go commit crimes and the world will collapse is ridiculous because that's not their true intent. The impact here, society doesn't collapse under this. We have to understand that. And the motion does not actually change the real world outcome. It changes their resolve and their intent. So again, Judge, you have to understand here that all of our contentions are incredibly important. Our first contention of full responsibility, that people aren't responsible for what they do because they're held accountable to what they do. Our second contention is that self-interest is a good thing. Our two sub-contentions about individualism for economy and individual for happiness, the impact people are happy and the economy grows, which makes people more happy. And our third contention about how it isn't anarchy, the impact of that is that society doesn't collapse. And so for all of those reasons, Judge, I strongly urge you to cast a proposition ballot. Thank you.
All right, if everyone's ready, I'll begin. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Liu. Today, with my partner, Charlie Flamm, we're going to be arguing the opposition side of this House prefers a world with widespread belief in radical freedom. Of course, the definition of radical freedom is all there. We want to emphasize the last sentence of radical freedom being these choices are not individual in the sense they don't affect other people, but rather in the sense that nobody can override one's own conscience. So just a quick note we want to make. In this society where this world has a widespread belief in radical freedom, obviously it'd be integrated within the society and everyone would follow the belief of radical freedom. And radical freedom would be an established philosophy. So our first contention, we want to sum up radical freedom. It's a way of living. Anybody can choose what they want to do immediately and they can do whatever they want. And theoretically, that sounds a good idea. But the key part of this philosophy you should take issue with this is the most important part, being that radical freedom places a greater emphasis on a person's decision to do whatever they want without consideration for anyone else or the correctness of their actions. Right now, we live in a world where we do have some degree of freedom, right? We can technically do what we want. We believe that we have the right to choose actions that we do. However, at the same time, we also take into account, is this acceptable because of the law? Does the government accept what I'm going to do? How will this affect other people? How are our actions, are they moral? Are they immoral? We always take those ideas into consideration. The thing about radical freedom is that it places a greater priority on a person being able to do whatever they want and without any consequence or thought of what's right or wrong or how it'll affect other people. So it's essentially just selfish. If a world suddenly became believers in radical freedom, that would mean that every individual on the planet now believes that whatever they do, they have the absolute right to do so and should do so. Now, our opponents seem to believe, not right now, our opponents seem to believe that part of radical freedom involves some sort of government. They're trying to say this as if the world, which has previously in our current world not been radical freedom, suddenly decided to implement radical freedom and people were still struggling to mix the two together. This is not the world that we're talking about. In this world that we are debating, the world has already been believers in radical freedom for a long time. So it's deep set within society. Now, the core part of radical freedom is that these individuals, that nothing can override what an individual wants to do. So with the existence of with the existence of a philosophy that explicitly believes that whatever you do is correct and nobody should be able to tell you, well, you can't do this. That means a person cannot face any resistance from anyone else. They can't face resistance from the law or the government. And as a result, that belief is disastrous. It essentially to mark the collapse of government, the idea of the state, and would cause a collapse in our current society as a whole, right? Our opponents, they continue to try to say that, right, there's still going to be a government, but they're acting as if we're still making a transition to radical freedom. But in this world where radical freedom is accepted, everyone believes that if you believe you can do something, you're in the right to do it and you should do it, right? Radical freedom in a sense is incompatible with the state or the government because you can't accept an external force controlling people in a society which truly believes in radical freedom. Thus, the government and society as a whole would collapse. The most notable consequence of this, firstly, would be crime. Immediately, crime and violence would increase notably because the idea of radical freedom involves no rules around what you can't or can't do.
EOI?
Not right now. Radical freedom says that whatever you want to do, you have the right to do so, and nothing can override your conscience. Not a government, not morality, not the law, not a police officer. So whether you want to commit murder, you want to commit assault or theft or assault or rape or far worse, you have the right to do so, and you can do so under what radical freedom means. Like radical freedom does not allow, it's incompatible with external control like law enforcement, and laws overall. So people, if they want to do things like murder or other forms of violence, and they really believe they want to do murder, they can do so at will without any opposition, even if it's a morally wrong action, because radical freedom justifies the right to commit murder. Now, just think about that sentence for a second. Is that a world where you want to live in? Like a world where radical freedom exists will suffer from widespread crime, violence, assault, all the forms of crime you could possibly think of, leading to countless deaths and injuries, thus giving us a huge impact in our favor. Right. Continuing on with his elaboration of what radical freedom allows you to do and what happens after the collapse of the government, we see a total breakout in the social order. Like our opponent tries to preemptively say, no, this doesn't mean anarchy is going to exist. But with the lack of our governments, because a government and an external force controlling and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, that directly opposes radical freedom. So society with radical freedom would never have developed governments in the first place. So what other type of government would you have? Nothing, which means anarchy. Obviously, that's going to be a lot of problems. Simply just a breakdown of law and social functions. Nobody's really obligated to work. Nobody's obligated to do anything. The society would definitely not reach the state we are right now because you don't have to be a farmer if you don't want to. You don't need to work to produce goods if you don't want to. Nobody needs to work at power plants to sustain power and so on because there's really just no incentive for them to work, considering that currency would also be gone as a result of this anarchical system. So essentially the collapse of the states that happens because of radical freedom is just really a desolate wasteland where people do whatever they want, right? Radical freedom, its greatest concern is a lack of concern for others. It's a lack of societal organization and a lack of an obligation to do what's morally correct or to do responsible actions that allow for society to continue to function. Yes, there are good people within society, but there are also bad people within society too. And even if a small percent of our society was inherently bad and wanted to commit bad deeds, that would still lead to widespread crime, poverty, theft, things like that, right? Not only would a society collapse lead to widespread issues like poverty, hunger, a lack of any form of electricity or power, or far more, nobody can really do anything about it, since the government and a controlling authority, which could possibly do something to fix that, goes against the idea of radical freedom overall. So from there, I just want to go over our opponent's case and just talk about what their contentions are. So essentially, they're saying that radical freedom would make people happier. They give no explanation for why people under radical freedom would become happier than they would in the status quo. In fact, they seem to believe that radical freedom is somewhat close to the status quo, which is just not correct overall. Like people are currently happy the way they are living. They understand that they have some degree of freedom. They can choose what they want to do, but they are restricted by what the government tells them they can't do. Yeah, I'll take your POI.
So do you think that people in North Korea are happy because they have no freedom, no rights, and have to eat grass?
No, people in North Korea obviously aren't happy, but their government is totalitarian. We're not advocating for a totalitarian government. I can say the same thing back to you. Do you think people in an anarchical state are happy, not having any control, having crime be widespread, not being able to do anything? Like this flip end of the coin also works. So I also like to then continue to what our opponent's case. They talk about they really just try to focus on the individual without any thought of the collective, right? Our opponents they always focus on what the individual wants to do, what the individual believes is good for them. And while, yes, it isn't important for the individual to do what they believe makes them happy, radical freedom takes that to the greatest exaggeration possible by disregarding morality, but disregarding the effect in others, and really disregarding what people can be or cannot be allowed to do. So they sacrifice the collective in favor of happiness of the individual. Now, our opponents also, they bring up the big contention that people are inherently good. They have no warranting for why people are inherently good in the first place. They don't explain why people are inherently good, right? They're just saying, yeah, people are inherently good, and they expect you to take it on that. And the same way we could say, yeah, people are inherently bad. So you can't really believe that in this world where there is no government to tell you what you can or can't do, there's no morality that's important. People are just going to do good things because there's no warranting to back that, right? The majority of what our opponents say regarding the economy, regarding crime, regarding society, that is what currently exists in the status quo. They don't actually go for what radical freedom means, right? Our opponents have offered no benefits or no impacts whatsoever for why radical freedom is superior. Meanwhile, we told you exactly why radical freedom is bad when taken to the fullest extent, because we have to believe in a society that really believes in radical freedom. They are going to practice radical freedom to the best of their extent. And that's going to lead to just plain anarchy. That's going to lead to plain crime. Like our opponents brought up the example of a nuke, for example. In a society with radical freedom, if your conscience believes that you want to nuke, nobody can stop you, right? A government wouldn't exist to stop you. And nobody would tell you you can't do it because radical freedom says you can do whatever you want. Therefore, Judge, we support you. We urge you to support the opposition side. Thank you for your time.
Okay, I'm just getting my timer set up. Well. Okay, I think I'll just start on my first word. Okay, so let's go. Hello, my name is Sam Wiedman. I'm the MG, and I'm going to start by talking about framework. Then I'm going to refute their contentions and then go back. Actually, no, I'm going to start with our contentions and then go on to their contentions. Okay, so the framework here, they accepted our definitions. They didn't talk at all about framework really, and they accepted the framework here is happiness as we define as Aristotelian contentment. Okay, so we're debating whatever makes the side happier and more content. And that's the framework that's agreed. And this house is, I want to stress again, a rational human being, okay? So in the motion itself, in the definitions, like the person we're talking about is not a psychopath, okay? That like is mentally ill. And that's something I'm going to expand on later. So looking at our first contention, basically they refuted that it's not individual, that no one can override consciousness, and that the problem with this radical way of living is that there's no morality. And basically what the government opposition failed to prove here is why people that have freedom of choice are inherently immoral, right? It's not first of all, like what even is the alternative? Like, are oppressed people moral? Like that wasn't explained. No, thank you. And so that wasn't explained at all. Why like people like are somehow less moral when they have freedom of choice, and how giving people the freedom to do what they want would make them bad. Now, I think what they were trying to explain was that this is sort of in their second contention. There are no consequences, so people don't care if their actions are moral. But the key thing here is that refuting their second contention, which is sort of like the same thing here. So their second contention is kind of a response to our first contention. And to refute their second contention, what they're saying is that people don't care about consequences. But what I say is that basically the thing about radical freedom is that it only changes your internal resolve. There's nothing in the motion that says that somehow external consequences are all lifted. They gave the example of nuclear weapons as well, like get nuke. And so like basically if I decide like I want to blow up the whole world, like I just suddenly decide that that's what I want to do, I'm rational or whatever, like it's not explained how there are no consequences and how people are able to even get that nuke. So like there are still massive external consequences in this world. And again, our first contention is key here because people are accountable, okay? Like in our world, the only people that can be charged with a crime is the person themselves, more or less. Like people have the sole, like absolute intent to do this. They are punishable. And that part of our first contention is not refuted at all. Sorry, about the noise. Okay, so basically people are entirely accountable. There are still external consequences. There are still morality because people are accountable. And the opposition did not attack my partner's very strong logic here. It's all in the flow for why people are accountable. The second thing is that
POI.
Yes.
If there's no state, who's going to keep them accountable?
That's another thing. Why does like it was not explained at all why having some sort of radical freedom means that it's anarchy, right? And we had a contention that's literally our third contention is like the world would not be anarchy. That was not responded to at all. We have a full contention responding to that. They have nothing to explain why the world would be anarchy. And they really have to prove why specifically it would be anarchy in order to do this. And basically it's not anarchy because, and I'll get into this. So our second contention, yeah?
You seem to be conflating radical freedom with our current status quo. So how is your world with radical freedom any different with the status quo?
The difference in our world, like I'm just going to read the definition of radical freedom here. So radical freedom, existential belief, notion that people have absolute power to choose how they will act. So basically they have full resolve and full intent over their actions, right? If I want to decide to be a farmer, like the world, like I have the full intent and resolve to stop that. I'm sorry, I just took it. And so basically, they didn't refute our second contention at all, where people that are self-interested, the economy grows, right? They did not refute that at all. That's the whole point of like self-interest. They did not refute that at all. And another thing is that people who are acting in their self-interest are happier, right? If I want to be a factory worker, or like I don't want to be a factory worker, I want to be a doctor. And if through radical freedom I can achieve being a doctor and not a factory worker, I will be happier, okay? So basically, people who can achieve radical happiness are happier. This is fundamental. Basically, people doing what they want to do are happier. This is rooted in Adam Smith, John Locke, like literally, like the entire philosophy of the West stands behind this case.
POI?
No, thank you. And so basically, on strengthening our third contention, I also want to bring up the idea of Socrates, which is basically that the only good is knowledge and the only evil is ignorance. Essentially, the people who do wrong only do so because they don't fully understand the consequences. And in our world, we still have consequences. So it's not clear why people having full control, absolute power over their intent will somehow reduce this. On the first contention, basically, on the whole, op has to prove that the government is somehow psycho to win. Basically, that people when they have absolute power and radical freedom, they will somehow be totally psycho and disregard any sort of collective and morality and everything that makes us human. They have to prove that to win, Judge. They literally have to prove that humans, as we know it, would have to stop being human and have to be total psychos and not be rational, which is what the House is, in order to win. Because like humans actually do have basic needs to be in communities, because human needs ultimately are to survive, right? Like that's our goal. And happiness is like one way of achieving it, right? Like exactly. And so like, and you want stability. Humans are collective animals. Like these are like, we have to just use such basic logic to refute their contentions. And so basically, instead of having no consequences, we have maximum consequences where everyone is totally accountable for their actions because it's only they have maximum control over their resolve, so they have maximum consequences. People want to be happy, and rational people aren't really murdered by being happy. Like that's not how rational people work. That's how psychos work when they're mentally ill. Like that's not a rational person. Somehow that some people are bad and that people won't work. Well, the thing here is that people, on their second contention, that people want to work because if people stop working, the society will collapse and they will not live, right? We don't have robot overlords to handle the economy for us yet. And that's like so far outside the contention. So basically people would actually work harder. Our second contention still stands and refute this. Their third contention is about how some people are bad, but again, rational people aren't bad. Just go back to my partner's logic, where he explained that literally all of this was simple logic. All of it still stands. It was not refuted at all. Like, you can just look right back there. It's all there. The logic itself is not refuted. And so we basically fit the framework by making people happy, because people acting in their self-interest are happier. People are not willing to do crime because the basic law of humanity that like people aren't psychopaths still stands. People aren't willing to do that. The opposition had no reason to explain why people would suddenly turn into anarchic psychopaths by having control of their intent, while we have a really detailed explanation as to why like all of this logic still stands about rational freedom. So like basically I've refuted their case, I've explained how my partner's case still stands, and explained that we fit the framework because people acting in their self-interest are happy. Thank you.
All right, just do one thing. All right, is everyone ready? All right, so I'll start my time. I just want to go through 3 main points before I begin. The first being the term of rationality, rational. Someone making a crime is an individual's own rational choice, which is in accordance to their own logic to commit a crime of that individual, right? So someone who commits a crime is still making a rational choice. The term rational is in accordance to a certain logic. So just like, let's believe you believe in Nazism. If you commit like a war crime as such, that's a rational logic in accordance to Nazism. So rationality can be a much broader term than our opponents are trying to make it. So I want you to keep that in mind, Judge, when you're considering this round. Secondly, they keep on using this phrase of basic logic. It's a simple principle, but they don't actually explain why this is basic logic or even explain the warranting into this. The only kind of warranting that we see here, Judge, is them citing famous philosophers to try to prove their argument when they don't even explain why that's applicable to this round. I could easily apply Max Stirner to this round or other philosophers and such. I'm going to protect time and make it into this round, but that's not. I'm going to actually warrant my arguments. And thirdly, I just want to point out how our opponents in their last speech said we didn't respond to a lot of their points and such. We haven't had our second speech yet, so I'd really consider you not to consider we didn't respond yet to most of these things, as we've only had one speech, which is supposed to build up our contention. So it's absolutely ridiculous for our opponents to expect us to respond at this point in the argument. Now I want to go down their second speech. They say that they give the nuclear example, and I want to make this clear that they brought this up, but with the nuclear example, it is a rational choice. But let's take him for example that this happens according after the status quo. There are nukes in this world, and let's say the president doesn't want to be president anymore because he doesn't feel the pressure to anymore. Who is going to be in control of those nukes? It's a highly possibility that these nukes can get out of control and spiral into the wrong hands, and then it could be a disaster. Give me 1 second. And to answer the question of why we would be an anarchist society is that individualism and statism are contradictory terms, and individualism and collectivism are not compatible. So we either cannot have a state force externally controlling the individual, or else the individual would not be controlling the individual, and thus this theory would not happen. So literally, there cannot be a state power influencing the individual for this topic to be asserted. Yeah, go ahead.
So you'd say a corporation is capitalist. Capitalist, we can say, is like individualist. Aren't like, it's a collective, right? It's an organization, right? People can be structured in individualism, right?
Yeah, I don't see how that referring to what I'm saying, though. I'm saying a state power right now. I'm not talking about capitalism or a corporation or anything. And I never said capitalism. I never even mentioned the word capitalism thus far. So I don't really understand the relevance to this round. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to explain why a little more, why there would be no state or government with this ideology. So a lot of these jobs, such as a farmer, taxi drivers, and a factory worker, people don't want to do these jobs. People are doing this to make bears end. It's completely irrational to think that someone would grow up just to want to be in a factory working crazy hours and crazy long hours for like minimum wage. That's an absolute statement to assert. And our opponents do not give any warranting as to why people would still do these necessary jobs. Yeah, go ahead with your POI.
Would you not say that people have the inherent desire to survive, and so if that's the only job they can get, would they not want to take it?
Yes, but we have to understand, how will the individual choose to do such thing? The individual will always try to be the best. Like, you can't just say that different individuals will know what they're going to do at the first instinct. It's going to be complete chaos. And with this chaos, it's going to be a lot of death and such. And people aren't going to necessarily step up into the role of a farmer immediately. It's going to be a lot of chaos and ensuing stuff that's going to inevitably involved in returning back to the status quo, because we need this external power and not this ideology to continue in this life, because they were even saying that everyone will be happier choosing their own job. If that's true, people aren't going to want to choose a crappy job like a 5 a.m. to like 7 p.m. farmer job that works like minimum wage hours. It's absolutely ridiculous to assert such a statement. So with that, we would see a really hard time upholding a state power in the government, because we wouldn't even be able to provide for a collective. So with that, I'm going to continue down their second speech. They keep on saying that, citing like philosophers and like keep on saying like people would work in their self-interest and thus that would make them happier. As I explained before, people working in their self-interest is a bad thing inherently, because people always want to do the thing that'll make them happy. 9 times out of 10, that's not that crappy factory worker job that's going to uphold society. It's going to be that corporate big man job or something as such that's going to make them have power and make them above everyone else. That's what they're going to want, because in this society, people are just going to do whatever they want in accordance to a certain logic. Now I'd like to go down their first speech. So they say that people will take full responsibility and that people will just feel a need to help others. This is also all based on like a certain culture or like a certain collective idea that everyone will feel responsibility. Certain cultures and like certain upbringings would not ensue that people would feel responsible. So this is very dependent on a certain culture and a certain ideology that people would be raised up with, that they would have to feel this responsibility. In addition, we can take the example of like, I can use World War I, for example, and such, and World War II, where people did do what they want as the individual, and we can see how that resulted. In lots of monarchies, etc., it doesn't really work out. I also want to explain that while people are going to do whatever they want, that can also mean that they can make crimes, and that's also a rational decision. So their whole ideology that crime just goes down is really based on like 2 philosophers' ideologies, which they don't warrant at all to you, Judge. They just cite them, which is really not proper for this type of debate, but regardless, they don't warrant it, so you shouldn't consider it, Judge. Yeah, go ahead with your POI.
POI?
Yes, go ahead.
So what incentive do these people have to commit crimes? Like I brought this up in my first contention. Like why would they commit a crime? What's their inherent desire?
So there's a plethora of crimes, and I think we're focusing too much on violent crimes this round. A lot of crimes actually come from the financial side. Let's take tax fraud, for example, and people not actually like doing the right proper exchanges, trade, etc., regulations, climate exchanges and such. So basically a big factory worker or like an oil company owner would not follow these economic or global and like regulations to follow like the proper climate change plan or make sure the climate is safe and such, because that's not going to be beneficial for them. They'll have an incentive to make more money, because as you guys can concede, you said in your second and first speech that the individual is going to try to make more money, because in your theoretical world, there's going to be money. They're always going to try to be shortcuts, and the top rich people will always try to make these shortcuts and not follow the law. In addition, rational people at the bottom will start to get angry at this. And so the rational decisions will be to uprise against these people. And that's going to be inherently violent, but that still makes them rational, because they are working within their own logic as the individual. So just to kind of conclude my speech before I let my partner weigh in the next speech, we tell you, Judge, that there will be no consideration of others, and society will collapse with the government as well, which could make things such as like the COVID-19 vaccine distribution impossible to even conceive in this society such as this. And things such as like police would never happen, because no one would believe in an external force oppressing the individual, because that would require a state, which isn't going to happen, as I warranted and explained before. We also tell you, Judge, that there aren't going to be enough food workers, power workers to uphold a society where people will live and not die, and they'll die before like 40 or something in this society. So we tell you, Judge, that in the status quo, we can uphold a much healthier living lifestyle and a much better and happier lifestyle for the individual as well. Thank you. I affirm to oppose. Thanks.
All right, I believe it's my turn. Judge, are you ready? All right, I begin. So I just want to summarize the big points of clash that we're talking about and then do a bit of weighing. Right? So our opponents continue to conflate radical freedom with the status quo. They continue to misinterpret the definition of radical freedom to literally be the same thing as the status quo. When I pressed them in my POI for how exactly things would change, they were unable to actually give a response. They just repeated the definition in the resolution, right? So all their impacts of lowered crime or an improved economy are legitimately not any different from our current world. They say that in a world of radical freedom, a factory worker can become a doctor. That is legitimately possible in our current status quo. There is no difference from what they are saying radical freedom is to our current status quo, because they simply just misconstrue the definition of radical freedom. They're trying to say the world is still going to have government, the world's still going to have laws and a free market, which is just really non-existent in a world that has belief in radical freedom, right? The most important thing that we need to emphasize is that this world that we're talking about, radical freedom is going to be an inherent belief that everyone agrees in and believes in. What makes radical freedom different from the status quo is that people living in this world where radical freedom is the norm, they believe in the right of somebody to do whatever they want. And if somebody wants to do something, nobody can or should stop them in that world. As a result, in that hypothetical society that we're talking about, it's simply just impossible to form societies, governments, or laws, because the idea of a government externally controlling what you do is just simply incompatible with radical freedom. Thus, what we are left with in all circumstances is just anarchy. Right? Our opponents' impacts are literally the status quo, which the status quo contains a government, the status quo contains laws, the status quo contains ideas about responsibility, about morality that just don't exist in a world of radical freedom, because the most important thing in a world of radical freedom is what you want to do. And there's no other consideration besides from just purely what you want to do, and nothing can override that, right? If you want to commit murder in this hypothetical world where radical freedom is the norm and everyone agrees with it, they're going to accept what you do and nobody's going to stop you and nobody's going to punish you because it's your choice to do that. So in addition, our opponents continue to try to say this house is a rational actor and that all people are moral. Once again, there's no warranting for why all people are moral. We could easily just say without warranting that all people are inherently evil as well, right? Citing a philosopher, which they've done multiple times, is not an argument where there's no warranting. A rational actor, like my partner brought up in his last speech, could be completely rational, completely sane in the head, but still have intentions to hurt others. Like, for example, the Nazis. A bunch of Nazis were rational people, but their actions still hurt lots of people. And in this world without radical freedom, where responsibility doesn't exist, where morality doesn't exist, nobody's going to care or stop them. Right? The existence of people who are immoral, which is guaranteed, is already enough to make the world a living hell for ordinary people, such as this house, which makes happiness extremely low. Whether you believe that all people are inherently moral or inherently immoral is just really beyond the point, because in a system with anarchy, there is inevitably going to be actions that harm you or people that commit things without any regard for any regards of the after effects or the consequences of their actions. So overall, what we see in this debate is that our opponents trying to advocate for the status quo, which is completely different from radical freedom. Their explanations for why crime would go down, people would be happier, and the economy be better are literally the same as the status quo. They literally do not know what the definition of radical freedom means. Meanwhile, on our side, we've demonstrated and explained time and time again why the state, the government, and laws are incompatible with the world where radical freedom exists, right? Radical freedom has no concern with the effects of your actions on other people. It has no concern about the morality of your actions, because the most important thing in a world of radical freedom is if you want to do it or not. And if you want to do it, nobody's going to stop you and nobody can stop you. Thus, the only option in a world of radical freedom is anarchy. Like, even if people try to live their best in peace, if people are going to get in arguments, they're going to be unhappy with each other. Some people are just going to be care. They have every opportunity or potential incentive to commit murder, theft, or rape. That's just the reality, right? There's always going to be a reason that somebody can find to do that. So if we compare impacts, we give you a world where radical freedom, we would have major negative impacts and hugely bad ramifications. So referring back to our framework of happiness and what's really just best for society as a whole, we can see that our side where radical freedom doesn't exist, we completely outweigh on every single point of magnitude, given that we avoid anarchy. We avoid just freedom to do whatever you want, which includes murder or rape or kidnapping, which is why we urge you, Judge, to support our opposition side. We cannot support a world where radical freedom exists. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I have 5 minutes, 30-second grace period. I'm just gonna, before I start my time, brief off time roadmap, I'm going to talk about.
Sorry. Roadmaps are supposed to be part of the structure of your speech.
All right, no worries then. I'll just do it. Okay. All right, so let's get right into this. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the idea, they brought up an idea about how government and the state are incompatible with the idea of radical freedom. So I'm just going to read you the exact definition again. Radical freedom, an existentialist belief, is the notion that people have the absolute power to choose how they will act in any given situation and in their lives as a whole. Tomorrow morning, anyone can choose to become a vegan or take up snowboarding, quit school to become a farmer, or go on a crime spree. These choices are not individual in the sense that they don't affect other people, but rather in the sense that nobody can override one's own conscience, right? Keyword here being conscience, right? The idea that no one can override one's own conscience is the whole idea of it is it's an internal struggle. No one can tell you internally that you shouldn't do something. That doesn't mean there are not going to be consequences. My opponents have said, oh, we've misconstrued the definition, but have failed to offer any point in the definition as to why we misconstrued it. And then they decided to conflate our idea with radical freedom equals the status quo, which is just false, because you have freedom in the current status quo, yes, but radical freedom takes it to the maximum, which isn't the status quo. And again, I'd like to hammer this point home. My opponents claim that we've somehow misconstrued the definition, but I just read it to you. And Judge, if you'd like, just tell me. I challenge my opponents to tell me at any point where it says it's incompatible with government, because no one can override one's own conscience implies an internal struggle rather than external consequences. There is no incompatibility here between external consequences and the internal struggle. And so what this means, Judge, is that their entire kind of our refutations to our case fall apart, because their whole idea was that we misconstrued the definitions and radical freedom is incompatible with government, which I've shown you just isn't the case. They admitted that there are some good eggs and some bad eggs, right? The issue here being that if people want to inherently help others, and like people are inherently good, if people want to help others, they admitted this, then people are going to try and do something to benefit other people, right? And that means society. The innate desire to survive is above all else, because if you don't survive, you're not happy. The innate desire of survival is ultimately above everything else. And so the only way that humanity can survive in this world is to organize, is to form a society. And while my opponents haven't proved that it's incompatible, we've shown you with logical warranting as to why it is. And they talked about how we have no warranting as to why people wouldn't commit crimes. So I can read again word for word with from my contention. Why is there any incentive for crime? No one would want to be a criminal because people get into crime to make money, but there's more money in this individual's economy. People don't inherently want to be criminals. They want stability, safety, and money. And as I explained, money can be easily gotten. They haven't refuted that point. So their whole idea that we have no warranting is completely false, because they've ignored all of our warranting and then claimed we don't have any. So again, that's their point refuted. So now going to their idea, first of all, they said that the Nazis were rational. That's ridiculous. They were completely irrational and insane psychopaths who believed false things, such as that the Jews were responsible for problems. I fail to see how that's rational. And their definition of rational has been conflated with some things that are absolutely insane. Like, I wouldn't call the Nazis rational, yet my opponents are claiming to do that and then extrapolating to say that everything will be complete anarchy because rationalism apparently includes Nazism, which is utterly insane. So I've told you why good people want to help. Society has to organize to survive, and because the desire of survival is innately above everything else, there has to be government and there will be a state. So it's compatible with individualism. My opponents are blowing everything way out of proportion and then claiming that we don't address anything when it's in fact the exact opposite. My opponents are claiming that there's going to be complete anarchy when they don't have any warranting to show you why government and state is incompatible with the definition of radical freedom, other than stating that it is. They've ignored our warranting and claimed that we only cited philosophers. And while yes, we cited philosophers as a secondary in point of information, we actually did a bunch of warranting in our first contention, which was completely unrefuted, and so therefore it still stands. All of our contentions stand. None of their contentions stand because they've way overblown everything. And I'm now going to get into weighing, right? The idea here, the weighing honestly here is that the individualism versus a collectivism. And so we can compare worlds here. In our world, individuals do what they want. There is still punishment. There are still consequences for their actions, because if I'm a good police officer, if I'm say a good person, I want to punish criminals. I want to help someone. So I can go and I can say, okay, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to throw you in jail. Why does radical freedom not use that? Because I can affect other people's actions. My opponents have failed to understand this logical fallacy, and as a result, their entire case against us falls apart. So again, going back to the idea of individualism versus the collective, right? In our world, individualism is rampant, right? People do what they want, and the idea of Adam Smith, the economy is much better off for it, and people are happier. My opponents didn't really address the framework of Aristotelian contentment, and we achieve that in our world by people doing what they want to do, and their innate conscience cannot be changed. Meanwhile, in my opponent's world, the collective, they haven't actually shown you their world at all, which is the status quo. But again, I think the idea of Aristotelian contentment, not everyone is content right now, but in that society, there are far more people that are content because they are doing what they want. And that's ultimately the most important thing. Again, the innate desire to survive is above everything else. And to survive, people will organize, they will create a government, they will do the essential jobs because they have to in order to survive. And so, Judge, I strongly urge you to cast a government ballot. Thank you.